Good morning. Welcome to Freeway Bible Study. I'm your host, Kurt. I'm a non-believer, but I like to study the Bible. So let's study the Bible. This is Genesis 47. This is where famine is going to do its worst, and we're going to see the resulting social and economic changes that are going to be brought about as a result of this famine on Egypt. So Joseph, the hero of the day, kind of, I'm starting to have second thoughts about that, has brought 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh to give audience to the king. And you'll remember perhaps that Joseph had instructed his brothers that when I bring you before Pharaoh, I want you to tell him that you're shepherds. This is because apparently shepherds are, the Egyptians are farmers. Tending sheep and cattle is a secondary pursuit, and so they don't hold it in quite the same regard. And stating that they're shepherds will indicate that they're not really much of a threat to the Egyptians. They're it's kind of like saying, your interest is kind of a secondary pursuit. It's useful, but it's not the main thing. So that will please Pharaoh, even though this is the same Pharaoh who just one chapter prior was openly encouraging Joseph to bring his family down and become members of his kingdom. Live in the land of Goshen, the best land in the kingdom. There are the rich, fertile soils of the Nile, good for both raising crops and for raising sheep, I guess, as well, for good grazing land. So that's what happened. So the 5 brothers come before, and Pharaoh asks them their occupation, and they do as Joseph said, and they say we're shepherds. And Pharaoh reiterates his previous promise, which is to give them land in Goshen, to tell them to go forth. He then has a special audience with Jacob and asks Jacob his age. He says, I'm 130 years old, and my life's been a pretty miserable. He kind of gives a queen for a day moment. My short years have been not very blessed. Not sure exactly what he's complaining about. He's got 13 sons, and I guess he's done pretty well for himself. But maybe it was because of all that worry, all those years when he thought he'd lost Joseph. But now he's reunited. Anyway, and then in the end, Jacob blesses Pharaoh, which I found interesting. It must be a significant thing related to Joseph's advanced age. The old people blessing the younger, even though the younger happens to be the lord of the land. So then they go off and settle in Goshen. Now we have kind of a pan back with the camera back, and we're watching Egypt unfold over the series of, I think, 2 or 3 years. We're in the first year of the famine. Remember, we're only 2 years into the famine at this point when Joseph's family, when Jacob and the rest arrive in Egypt. And we, in the next year, this would be the 3rd year of the famine, the people have spent all their money. They have no more money. So they can't buy food. Remember, Joseph is not giving the food away, he's selling the food. And so they say, rather than have us starve, can we give you our cattle in exchange for food? And Joseph agrees to that. Remember, he's the lord of the granary, so to speak. And that exchange is made, and the people live another year, but they no longer own their cattle. And then the 4th year comes, and the famine still lays over the land. And Joseph knows this is going to happen because he's got the inside track with God, who told him that the famine would last 7 years. So in the 4th year, the people come and say, listen, we don't have any money, we don't have any cattle to sell you, all we have left to sell you is our land and ourselves. And Joseph says, sounds like a good deal to me. And so he then strikes a bargain and takes possession of all the people's land and their person. Very interesting. I was like, I've read the Bible. I've read this section of the Bible at least 3 times in the past, and I never picked up on this. It's probably because I wasn't reading it so carefully. Now I'm reading the Bible very carefully. I'm reading each chapter, a minimum of 5 times, and across 2 different versions of the Bible. I mean, I think it's really interesting so stuff's popping out that it didn't before. And I struggled at first trying to think, well, what kind of economic system is this is a huge socioeconomic change that's underway in Egypt. What is this? At first I thought, is it socialism? Then I thought, wow, is it communism? All the land is being owned by not the people, consensually owned. And then I realized, no, because the land is not owned ostensibly by the people, but by Pharaoh, because Joseph is giving all of this to Pharaoh. And then it finally dawned on me when the next part comes, and the people are grateful, because they're like, it's either die or give all this stuff up. And Joseph is taking care of them. He's giving them food. And then it finally dawns on me when Joseph says, I'm going to give you now in the next year, the 3rd year after, so this will be the 5th year of the famine. Joseph says, I think it's the 5th year, or maybe it's still in the 4th year. He says, here, I'm going to give you've given me your money, your cattle, your land, and your bodies. Now I'm going to give you seed so that you can go till the land, and furthermore going to redistribute your persons where I see fit. He's basically, can you imagine that he's actually moving people around from cities to country, saying, you can then till the land, and I want you to give to the crown, so to speak, a fifth of what the ground produces. And it suddenly dawned on me. It took me an overnight to think about it. It suddenly dawned on me. I don't know why it took me so long. Serfdom. This is serfdom, where the state owns the land, a great landowner, and we have tenant farmers that are paying homage to the great lord. This is the system of serfdom. And the author of this particular book of Genesis, who's writing from hindsight, of course, many believers believe it was Moses himself that was writing this, says that that this system continued to this day. So that apparently this system worked, which is interesting. And I know that things will change for the Jews shortly, the Hebrews, maybe I should say. But at this point, all of Egypt has fallen into serfdom. Except, and this is notable, except the priestly class. And that's because they got a stipend automatically from Pharaoh, and because of that, they didn't need to sell their land. So they were able to maintain their independence and autonomy in a way. I mean, they're still subject to Pharaoh by virtue of the fact that they had this allowance from Pharaoh. So they were that creates a state where the only real free individual is Pharaoh and the priests. What is that? Now, the priests don't own the land, but they certainly have some control and some independence. I think that's still serfdom, with maybe a touch of theocracy, perhaps? Just a dab? Not so sure. Astonishing. I've got to give more thought to that today. I will be thinking about this. I guess the most interesting thing was that the idea that we think of the Jews as being enslaved in Egypt, but at this point, everybody is enslaved in Egypt except the priests and the king. So now, and what's more, everybody's very grateful for that because of the state otherwise, which made me wonder. This was, at first I thought, well, God wasn't behind this. This is, I thought, God definitely endorsed what I called the socialist system that we saw when God told Joseph to take over the granaries and lay aside a fifth of the harvest for the future. I thought, oh, that's socialism, and then I could attribute that to God because God specifically instructed Joseph to do that. But I couldn't quite do the same thing. I couldn't say that God supports serfdom in this case because God didn't specifically tell Joseph to buy up everything and to make everybody into serfs. However, this was a consequence of the plan that God put into place. So you can kind of say that God had his hand in this, and that this new state is rather sanctioned by God. Interesting. There's another part of that I wanted to touch on. I saw that motorcycle and it distracted me, kind of like a dog seeing a squirrel. Getting distracted. There was something else. What was it? Well, while I try to remember what it was, I'll go over the other thing. I noticed in this chapter, so now Abraham, I remember what it was. It was the fact the way to get people to acquiesce, an interesting social element, the way to get to people to accept such a circumstance, such slavery even, is to get them to a state where they're even lower than that, where this looks good. And that's exactly what happened. They were facing down starvation and death, were becoming tenant farmers, giving up 20% of their income to the state seemed like a good thing. Which actually, if you think about it, was probably pretty generous for the time. I mean, serfdom probably was a pretty common thing. I mean, there weren't too many liberal democracies running around at this time, unless maybe up in Greece. So maybe it wasn't that bad. But it was interesting how the engineering worked. It says bring the people so low that even serfdom looks good. So now Joseph and Jacob are having a little chat, and Jacob says, I'm so happy that this all worked out, and I think my time is nearly up. Now he's 147 years old. Wait a minute. What? How can that be? Okay, we know that he told Pharaoh in the same chapter that he's 130, and then at the end of the chapter, Jacob dies at the age of 147. So we must have had a jump in the way forward machine that I missed, because I thought we were still dwelling right around that fifth year of the famine, fourth or fifth year of the famine, which would have still been 130 years. So I missed something. I'll have to go back and read that. If I can remember and catch it, I'll mention it in tomorrow's video. We'll see. There's a nice Harley. Hey! So that's it for Genesis 47. I didn't mention this yet. I spotted one other oddity. Did I mention this? Which was the fact that I almost forgot there was the last bit. Jacob knows he's about to die, and he tells Joseph. And before he tells him, he says he wants him to swear to him. He asked Jacob to lay his hand under his thigh. And I looked that up way back in the story of Abraham, because Abraham asked one of his sons to do the same thing. Place your hand under your thigh. And I looked it up, and scholarship says that there's speculation. They don't know for sure, but they think that means cupping the man's testicles with your hands. And the idea is that if you're going to make a promise that will be binding even after death, so kind of like semen creates children that will survive beyond our death. So grabbing a man's balls and holding onto them while you make an oath kind of is like sealing the deal beyond the grave. A very interesting symbolism. Makes perfect sense. I'm glad we don't do it anymore, though. Ooh. But anyway, that's what happens. Jacob asks Joseph to grab a hold of his goodies, and while he's doing so, and make a vow that he will, after Jacob dies, that he will take Jacob back to Canaan to be buried with his fathers, which is kind of symbolic that the Canaanites, the Israelites, no more better apt time, they call them that than now, because this is in fact Jacob, aka Israel. The Israelites' home is indeed in the land of Canaan, not in the land of Goshen. And with that, I'll sign off. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye for Genesis 48.